Sorry about this. Yeah, we are live.
Can I share the screen now, or
Yes.
how can I share the screen?
You have a share button down.
Oh yeah, there, that's right. Can I share it now? Okay. Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Yao. I am a professor in Hunan Normal University. I come from China. My topic is about the postmodern turn in childhood study and its pedagogic implication. I'm going to talk about the four aspects, and then the first thing I want to make an introduction about this topic. Since the 1960s, postmodernism has stimulated criticism of modern discourse in various disciplines, including childhood studies. Postmodern research has yielded numerous fresh insight into childhood, promoting significant shift in perspective on childhood and education. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the following questions. How does the postmodernism impact childhood studies? What new understandings of childhood does it provide? How should we evaluate the contributions and the challenges posed by the postmodern paradigm shift in childhood studies in education? In the modern conception of childhood has inherited this fundamental spirit of modality, giving rise to three themes: rationality, naturalness, and universality. This includes the beliefs that childhood goes through a natural process of development, that all children follow universal laws of development, and that the rational stage of adulthood represent the ultimate goals of childhood. With the increasing criticism of modernity, many scholars have begun to question the modern conception of childhood. They will constitute within the framework of postmodernism as the principal ideological foundation, enabling the shift from the modern to postmodern understandings of childhood. By integrating the postmodern perspectives, we find that the postmodern turn in childhood study mainly embodies three typical characteristics. I'm going to talk about the first characteristic. It's about the rejection of essentialism regarding childhood and the recognition of the diversity inherent in childhood. The loose concept of rhythms characterized by difference and becoming, Derrida's critical of the legocentrism and Lyotard's skepticism towards meta-narratives or underscore this criticism of essentialism. The opposed essentialism, aspiring to construct intellectual frameworks in rooms rich with diversity rather than unity. Perspectives portraying childhood as fixed, idealized, homogeneous have been labeled as essentialism and scrutinized by researchers in childhood studies. Conversely, anti-essentialism, diversity, pluralism advocated by postmodernism has emerged as certain tenets among childhood scholars. The second characteristic is the deconstruction of binary oppositions and the advocacy from the heterogeneous of childhood and becoming child. Postmodernism adopts a similar critical stance towards binary oppositions and essentialism. For example, Derrida's endeavors to substitute the center with difference in order to reveal the concealed margins. Deleuze deconstruct binary opposition through the concept of becoming. Thus, postmodern thinkers have profoundly influenced the challenge to binary oppositions in understanding childhood. This including the deconstruction of dichotomy such as nature, culture, childhood with adulthood, being and becoming, structure and agency, etc. Childhood should be seen as neither natural nor culture, but a multiplicity of nature cultures. Drawing from Deleuze's concept of becoming child, Kennedy and Cohen endeavors to investigate a novel relationship between child and adult. As David said, becoming child is a line of flight, a trajectory of escape from the subject identified by the moral categories of class, gender, race, ethnicity, costume, and subjectivity itself as located in historical practices. The third characteristic is to display the modern subject with childhood and reconstruct the postmodern subject. Childhood researchers explore the concept of childhood to challenge modern subjectivity, reconstruct the postmodern subject, and consequently formulate a new comprehension of both subjectivity and childhood. In the framework of modern subjectivity, human reason becomes the source of all truths and values, constituting the principle of self-verification in modernity. Human beings are positioned as the subject and the center of the world. To deconstruct modern subjectivity, some postmodernists have identified children as rational others or valuable strangers. The characteristics of childhood, such as variability, dependence, and susceptibility to influence, served as ground for opposing the subject governed by reason, the fixed and singular rational subject, and the subject entirely independent of others. Consequently, postmodern children, with their fluidity and interaction with others, have emerged as a significant force in challenging modern subjectivity. So in the third part, I'm going to talk about the positive pedagogic implications of the postmodern turn in childhood studies. At first, under the influence of the postmodern turn in childhood studies, educators must discard previous notion of childhood solely defined by natural or social dimensions and instead explore children within the complex web of multiple influences. Postmodern childhood study also contribute to education by prompting reflect on adultcentrism, the role of teachers and students undergo quiet deconstruction and reconstruction. Moreover, within the process of postmodernist reflect on modern subjectivity, educators are encouraged to forge new subjects for children. But after that, I'm going to talk about the challenges to education brought by postmodern turn in childhood studies. The postmodern shift in childhood studies also harbors many dangers, posing challenges to education. That's what I'm going to talk about. First, the anti-essentialism of the postmodern understanding of childhood, with its embrace of free and pluralistic viewpoints, may lead to another form of closure. The absence of the universal values for evaluating various constructions of childhood could potentially shut down channels of dialogue. Secondly, the elimination of the dichotomy between childhood and adulthood also undermines the necessity of the concept of childhood altogether. Consequently, childhood ceases to exist and education loses its fundamental basis. At last, when education embraces a wholly mobile and involving subjectivity without questioning its identity and stability, its admirable risk may delve into a meaningless adventure. In conclusion, when education delves into the study of postmodern childhood, both its promises and dangers permits the education domain. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yao. I would like to invite John to comment on Yao's presentation.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Okay, thank you, Yao, for that really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I think the critiques that postmodernism can make of a universal subject and adult-child binaries are really important. And part of the problem is that within the field of childhood studies, these critiques are sort of well made in many ways, or known. Outside of the field, it's important to better frame what are these critiques about, and especially when you get into education or politics or other areas. I just want to make two or three points, both in response to Yao's comments and also just broadening the conversation a little bit. So one of the points is that the term postmodern, of course, is notoriously hard to define, and nobody really quite knows what it means. People reject being called postmodern. People define it in lots of different kinds of ways. And you've given us some thinkers to help us do that. But one of the points that's vital for me to include when defining postmodernity is the normative dimension or the structural dimension. So that when one refers to difference, for example, the difference between childhood and adulthood, it's clear that we're referring to a normative construct, that a social imaginary about that difference that's been built up over historical time. It's built into language, power structures, social relationships, and all kinds of other things. And it's actually not necessarily visible. So that in that case, a childist or or anti-adultistic, or however you want to call it, critique, it becomes a critique of what are our assumptions going into the world. And I think you've shown a little bit of how to do that in terms of developmental ideas of children and the like. But I think it's just important to note that what's meant by difference, usually in postmodernity, at least as I interpret it, is not plurality exactly. It's not diversity necessarily, although those are important. It's actually difference from the norm. So it's actually invisibility, marginalization, that sort of thing. And so that makes it a little bit harder to deconstruct. And another point I want to make is about childhood studies. My argument has been that the field of childhood studies has been largely a modernistic field. And there have been postmodernistic interventions into the field based on decolonial ideas or certain kinds of feminist ideas, critical race theory and queer theory framed in certain ways, but each of those types of theory can be either modernistic or postmodernistic. And I think that, I suppose for the purposes of our conversation, that I would not equate childhood studies with a postmodern turn. I would actually say that there is a need for a movement from what I call childhood studies to childism, in which we're not just trying to empirically listen to the voices and view the agency of children as children, but actually to challenge the normative structures that make those invisible and hard to see in the first place. So it's again a normative, there's a normative dimension to childhood studies, which is sometimes there and sometimes not there. And I think it's important to make that kind of move in the field. And then finally, the question of what is adult-centrism, or adultism is the term that I prefer to use. And for me, again, this has to be understood in a structural or normative sense, which means that it's something that's built into not just direct adult-child relationships, but actually into the ways that the world is thought about in a more general sense. So how is time understood? How is relationality or interdependence understood? How are power structures thought about? And so I think that a discussion of adult centrism needs to help us think about our broader social imaginations. We might need to rethink, for example, democracy. What is the purpose of that? Considering the fact that it automatically excludes a third of the world, really. And in these times that we're in, where we're facing severe crises in democracy, power relations, education, families and social structures in many different ways, not to mention the planet and the climate. Well, I think an adultist critique or a critique of the adult-centrism can help provide a critique of why are we in these messes at the moment, and what are some avenues to think in more creative, different ways outside them. So I think that just as feminism is not just a critique of whether women are listened to or not, childism is also not just a critique of whether children are paid attention to or not. It's a critique of what are the deeper structures giving rise to that. So that's my commentary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, if it's okay, we would move to Itai's presentation, which will shed some more light on also the structural issues, I believe, that John has pointed out. And we would have some time later if you would also either like to come back to John's comments or participate in the conversation more broadly. Thank you both, Yao and John. Itay, would you
Me?
like to begin your presentation?
Thank you.
Thank
I have 15 minutes, right? I'll try to time myself and hopefully I'll be smart enough not to take too long. So thank you. First, my name is Itay. I'm from Israel, and I must say, maybe it's obvious, but while we're having this interesting and very nice academic discussion, maybe we can also keep in mind that at least in my region, there are children being killed every day, mostly Palestinians, but also Israeli children have been buried yesterday after being killed. So something worth keeping in mind, I think. But it's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm very happy for the opportunity to, I will not use slides or anything, just my notes, so hopefully it will be understandable. I thank Tanu for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak about this paper I wrote, because it is very dear to my heart, since it involves two different areas of research in which I'm engaged, two that seem to be in some kind of tension. So the one is childism, and the other the study of the school as an educational institution. Now, childism is, again, is quite obvious in the context of our discussion. Broadly speaking, childism, of course, is an attempt to understand and challenge and critique the subordination of children to adults, and looking for ways for struggling against this subordination. The school is interesting not only because it is a central educational institution, at least in the modern age, but because it is under controversy. A controversy in which it is important, I'm involved in this controversy, and it is important for me to take sides in this controversy and to support the school, to try to defend the school. Now, school is being attacked everywhere, not so much by students, I think, but certainly by parents in public discourse and at the academia, where it is presented as a site of discipline, of unfreedom, of producing and reproducing the social structure of a cultural imposition, and so on and so forth. All this is quite true. That's right. And from my experience, it is sometimes even considered outrageous to try to defend the school in academic settings. But this is exactly what I'm trying to do. Not only for the provocation and the academic pleasure of presenting unpopular views, there is some pleasure in that, but not only because of that. Now, following Yao's presentation, I must say, although in other contexts, although in other contexts, I'm very careful not to fall into sharp dichotomies. In this context of discussion of the school, I want to be clear and simple and make the strong claim that the only alternative to public schooling, every alternative to public schooling, is a form of privatization, which is an idea or a trend which is very popular in our neoliberal times. But it is all the same very, very problematic. Declaring war on school in the name of anti-capitalism will achieve precisely the opposite of what it aims for. Because every alternative for the school, right, is a kind of privatization. And privatization is a contribution and strengthening of capitalism. Because it renounces in advance the possibility of public schooling, of education committed to the idea of equality, one that thinks about freedom with or through equality, and not simply as whatever, the right to choose or something like that. Now, I don't defend existing schools. I do try to conceive of a proper model for public schooling. Now, in a sense, this is not very different from what Tanu Biswas and others are trying to achieve when they call for a reform of public schooling, or what Tadek Abebe calls post-schooling. But the difference is not only semantic or semantical, it is also about language. I think rhetoric is important. And when we attack school, we are helping the neoliberals or the right-wing kind of economics and politics. But I think there are also fundamental, substantial differences. The model I adopt here for the sake of this paper and this conversation is the one presented by two Flemish philosophers, Jan Marcellijn and Martin Simons, in the book A Defense of the School, a Public Issue. But I'm not committed to this, or I hope I'm not dogmatically committed to this model. On the contrary, I'm trying to improve it. I'm trying to work with it and bring Childish thought into this model, something like that. So at the heart of this model, or this understanding of the school, is the concept of equality. Skole means freedom, but one that is understood through equality. Equality in school is expressed in various ways. I'll focus on two here. First of all, school liberates knowledge and skills from the hands of the elites, it makes them available, accessible to all. Right? Unlike private education, where knowledge stays in the family or the same social class. But school also produces equality between students by bracketing out family, social class, ethnicity, hopefully even gender, etc. The idea of the school is that in school, everybody are students. They are equally students. Of course, among the many bad things people say about the school is that school creates and recreates, produces and reproduces the inequality between children and adults. This critique also applies to Marcellijn and Simons's model, right? In their understanding of the school too, it is adults who transfer knowledge and skills or part of the world to the next generation. The reason I think that this model of the school has a childish aspect or dimension is that it challenges what I take to be the heart, or at least one of the central cores, one of the cores of adultism, namely the assumption that children belong to their parents. This assumption is the backbone of adultist culture and practices, right? As well as of so many attacks on the school, made in the name of the right of parents to determine what their children will learn, from who, with whom, etc. Now, children do not belong to their parents. They do not belong to the state either. This is also very, very important. And we must, of course, object to school education that sees them as, these children, as belonging to the state. But only private school can temporarily take children away from the family. Temporarily, of course. I realize that taking children away from their families may sound highly, highly problematic, especially when thinking about colonial contexts. Temporarily, taking children away from their family and telling them, you are free. Now, you are free from expectations originating in the family by people who know your family origin, etc., right? And now you can all freely and equally shape yourselves and choose who you are. Only a public institution can do that, right? Of course, a public institution is funded by the state, but it does not serve the state. Democratic institutions can do that. And this leads me to the second part of my paper that concerns minority cultures. School is often accused, rightfully accused, of imposing a majority culture and where am I? And a dominant culture on students, thereby attempting to eliminate indigenous or minority cultures, religious, ethnic, and so on, as long as they don't blend or mesh into the dominant culture or some kind of melting pot. Now, the first dimension of my answer to this common and important critique of the school is almost trivial. It's about the curriculum, saying that school must be sensitive to the plurality of cultures and traditions that are relevant in the relevant context, of course, and give room for all of them at school. And it is the responsibility is a very important concept in this understanding of the school. It is the responsibility of the teachers to make room for all those cultures and traditions, including, of course, minority, indigenous cultures and traditions. And when they don't do that, they betray, in a very simple term, they betray this fundamental educational responsibility. But the second and more important aspect of my answers concerns, once again, the fact that children do not belong to their parents, nor to their communities. Just as we must not impose the majority culture on them, we must not impose the family culture on them, even if it is a minority or indigenous culture. They need to be free. They are free to decide whether and how to be engaged with the tradition and culture of their families. Of course, there's value, there's important value in preserving tradition, but not by imposing them. Some traditions are wonderful. Some are probably childish, as I learned, right? But there's nothing childish about in imposing a tradition or culture on a child. And only a public school can maintain the kind of distance needed for a child to get to know, to learn tradition without it being imposed on them, on the child, right? And I do think that this is not bad news for minority cultures. For cultures to be live and relevant, they need to be dynamic, open to novelties, to renewal. And this is best achieved when the young generation, when the new generation does not only choose whether and how to engage, and whether to engage, sorry, but how. How do we take on the culture, the tradition handed over to us from the previous generation? What do we do as a new generation? What do we do with this culture, right? And when the new generation renews, rejuvenates tradition, I think it also contributes to that specific tradition. I hope I'm clear enough. And I do think this is best achieved in a public school, as opposed to other forms of community kinds of education and other alternatives, which are first kinds of privatization of education. And I think they are also highly problematic when it comes to the rights and autonomy and freedom of children. So that's 15 minutes. Thank you very much. I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Itay, for this thought-provoking, compelling, also defense of the public school. David, I invite you to please share your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with Itay and the points that he makes, based on the Mascheline and Simon's book, which I think is sort of although it has its faults, it's sort of a profound statement for the moment. I totally agree on the dangers of privatization, although it seems to me to be almost a law of history that that new ideas and new practices will emerge from divergent institutions, so that private schools sometimes bring messages to the public school, which can be useful for the reconstruction of public schooling. The critique of conventional schooling is a damning one and is pretty universal, not just on the right, but on the left. And school is typically considered as a paradigmatic site of adult domination. An ideological state apparatus is sort of the term used. The childish critique tends to point to a school where adultism is not only conspicuous, but is also reproduced in the next generation. However, I want to, and make the emphasis on this talk, I want to recognize that the childish critique of conventional education has always been around, and it's been theorized historically and anthropologically, and associated with a rise of democracy as a social and political ideal. So childism, I would argue, has been a consistent theme in Western educational and sociological thought, a clear theme. And I think childism as a philosophy and as pointing towards a set of educational practices, it surfaces in the West. In the West, I can't speak for the East or the Middle East, but it surfaces in the West in association with the French Revolution, Rousseau's Emile of 1762, which sort of announces the new humanity, I think is implicitly suggestive of childism. His idea of childhood as an aporia and then it's carried forward in Enlightenment and Romanticism, especially in anarchism, progressive education, all of these movements which move through the 19th century seem to be implicitly childistic, and gives rise to a variety of child-centered, the idea of a child-centered institution, the free schools of the 1960s, contemporary democratic schools, various sort of deschooling or unschooling movements, which have been operating for at least half a century. They're all anchored in an emancipatory child-rearing philosophies and practices that are presented both as an original indigenous condition and as an evolutionary emancipatory ideal. So I'm claiming that childism is anchored both in studies of the past, the far past, and also in philosophies and practices which are futuristic. evolutionary ideal. So, for example, in Peter Gray, who wrote the book Free to Learn and has been a major advocate of childist educational practices in the last 30 years or so, talks about trustful or free parenting in his account of hunter-gatherer Paleolithic cultures. So this is childism in the past is modeled on the band of hunter-gatherers, which according to him value individual freedom and agency, sharing, egalitarianism, all of which are sort of tendered towards children, as children are included in these values, and gives rise to notions which we associate with anarchism, anarchist socialism, a stateless society, libertarian socialism, democracy, and deep democracy in particular. And this, I think, is a key point as we come to the idea of scholé from Mascheline and Simons. And another sort of finding the heart of childism in the past is associated with a book by Jean Liedloff, which was very popular in the 70s, called The Continuum Concept. Jean Liedloff, who spent lots of time among a tribe in the Venezuelan rainforest, the Yacuana, and came up with this notion of what she called and became called attachment parenting, which primatizes physical closeness with children, emotional responsiveness, empathy, positive discipline. So in this sense, childism is represented by these thinkers as something in the past, something in our prehistoric, but somehow essential nature. And looking to the future, we have people like Lloyd Demouse, the historian of childhood, with his stage theory, which culminates in what he calls empathic parenting. He's got sort of five different stages of historical child rearing, all of which are sort of based on the notion of the childist as the capacity to withdraw the projection of adults, withdrawing sort of their dark materials from children, because those reactions that lead to adultism and rejection of the child's nature. This childish ideal, which here is located in the past in Peter Gray and Jean Liedloff, both would say that the ideal is betrayed by the onset of, quote, civilization, which Gandhi said would be a good idea, remember? The onset of agriculture and social construction, institutions, agriculture, and he identifies then feudalist and industrialization, all lead to a colonial model, as described by Ashish Nandi in his book, The Critique of the Ideology of Adulthood. Here, child now in modern times becomes the native, aboriginal, the wild being, the stranger, sort of the dark impulses, the primitive threat to civilization, which must be tamed, disciplined, organized. And so we get this notion of what Gray calls directive parenting, either domineering, which we associate with, Demouse associates with intrusive, in which the child's nature has to be forcibly changed in order to become an adult. And through violence, whether that's physical, emotional, or just emotional, domineering parenting, and he distinguishes it from directive parenting, which we might Demause associates with the socialization mode, in which we sort of identify with behaviorism, in which we manipulate the child's energies towards adulthood. And all of this kind of summarized educationally in the village school, hearkening now back to when those hunter-gatherers were invaded by the colonial powers who came from the big city with their language and separated children. The village school becomes the ideological state apparatus, the colonial outpost where capitalism, conformity, repression are taught. All of this, and this is where I sort of return to Ite's paper, the idea from Maschlein and Simons of scolae, which we might characterize as another kind of village school, a dialectic, a village school which is actually does not impose colonialism, but actually undermines it. School in this concept, which is associated with the rise of democracy in 6th century BC in Greece, is constructed in Maschlein and Simons. I realize that we're taking the notion of scolae as the Greeks of the 5th century understood it, and romanticizing it, seeing it as a form of schooling which is directly associated with democracy, and not just representative democracy, but deep democracy. So returning to this anarchist ideal of the deep democracy as fundamentally a decentralized society, and the associations with childism of that. So the scolae, this school of still romanticized or idealized by us school of 5th century BC, is understood as an intergenerational encounter dedicated implicitly to social transformation and the ideals of deep democracy, whether explicitly or otherwise. So it's a democratic apparatus whose ideals and characteristics are more fundamentally reflected in anarchist theory. Maschlein and Simons in this book, The Defense of the School, and this is where Ite picks up on these points, calls for reinvention of the adult-child encounter. And the school is specifically originated in the Greek polis with a direct link to democratic politics. And it's characteristic of scolae is, first of all, that it's another kind of time, scolae meaning free time, and not just leisure, but free time for liberated time liberated from the technicians of the ruling class, the ideological state apparatus, and liberated for study in its original meaning of studium, the Latin studium, which means zeal or eagerness, enthusiasm, interest. And it operates through suspension, taking it out of the world of production, producing either adults or economic units, releasing it and lifting it from the normal context into a different world, what Ite calls a heterotopia, separated from the, quote, real world, a time and space detached from both society, the polis, and the household. And here, echoing Ite's remarks about parents. And so therefore, a place apart, this ideal of childist ideal of the school as a temenos or templum, as a place set apart for this encounter between adults and children. And now I'm quoting from Ite's paper. It brackets out the logic of efficiency and productivity according to which society and the household operate, making knowledge and skills temporarily objects of study freed of economic demands. In contemporary terms, school can liberate time from the instrumental shackles of capitalism rather than strengthen them. At the same time, it also brackets out the inequality inherent to the social order, which evaluates people according to the household to which they belong. In the egalitarian school time, all learners are equal and all are equally students. So this is a vision of school as an archetypal experimental space, a space of what Eleanor Duckworth called extraordinary investigations, an intentional community, a transitional space in the sense the dialogic school is the site where the reified distinctions between the real and the possible are interrupted and interrogated in the course of inquiry. It is most fully entered in and expressed through the arts, literature, scientific, and mathematical inquiry. Transitional space is the space of the artist studio and the experimental laboratory, and the magical performative space of music and dance and theater, as well as the group deliberative space of the kiva or council chamber, the space of what Buber called meeting. It is the space of extraordinary investigations, of embodied inquiry, which implies that by definition it is based on themes and topics that are of real interest to children. As a temporal zone, it is what Gadamer calls the temporality of the aesthetic, which he identifies with, quote, pure presence, and which Dewey identifies with what he calls consummatory experience. In other words, a space set apart for deep play or flow. The transitional is also the space in which we undertake, by way of critical and creative thinking and inquiry, the deconstruction and reconstruction of our epistemological universe, and we do that all across the disciplines. The transitional spaces between chemistry and physics and biology and mathematics, linguistics, anthropology, history, sociology, political science, and economics is in fact one polyvocal analogical space. So Skole represents a place set apart for which offers the freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm just posting links to both the articles in the chat. We could take a few questions if there are from the audience or any comments that someone would like to share. And I would just like to ask the speakers and commentators if it is okay that we go about 10 minutes over time since we started late. Would that be okay for you? Yeah, thank you very much. Priscilla, please.
Thank you, Tanu, for arranging the meeting with all the problems and getting through in the end. And thank you to the speakers. I'd like to question some of the things Ite said. One is children don't belong to parents. Well, there's belonging and belonging. They're not possessions to be controlled or sold, as in the past. But children belong to parents deeply in some ways. When your child dies, you realise this enormous, huge belonging that is lifelong, of love, commitment, care. And the children feel that in response. And that's evolved as part of humanity, as anthropologists have shown, that this commitment and care leads to survival. So we need to really think about the meaning of belonging. Secondly, schools don't impose cultures on children. Goodness me, they impose enormous cultures on children. Schools are highly regimented, especially in the UK and the US. And they, again, culture, we're imbued in culture all the time. A lot of it's subconscious. Children assume they live in houses, not usually in caves. They assume they're going to have Christmas presents if Christmas is the thing in their country. There are millions and millions and millions of things we assume about our culture. Thirdly, schools treat people equally. Schools are such inequality machines because learning, which little children do all the time, physically, through their senses, through their relationships, through their explorations, they're brilliant learners and learn more in their first 4 years than they will for the rest of their lives. Mostly not instructed, but through the motivation of self-learning and teaching. This is all stopped in schools, which turn physical sensory learning into the word, and then fail so many students because they have dyslexia or other problems and don't want to sit all day in a chair at a table, but want to run around actively. So there's a very interesting recent book in Britain, Bottom Set Citizens, written by someone from Chile, where it doesn't happen. And she says that UK and US schools really go for streaming and grading. And the children in the bottom set are dismissed as failures. They start behaving badly. So even the ones who want to learn find it very difficult. And interestingly, two people who were in bottom sets at their schools, Donald Trump, and in Britain, Nigel Farage, an echo of Trump, were both in bottom sets at their expensive boarding schools. Nigel was a day boy, Trump was a boarder. So, and I'd argue they specialize in appealing to the bottom sets, the people who feel rejected, angry, unfairly disadvantaged, and they stir up this anger and rage, which being in a bottom set at school starts winding up. And we really need to look at how adult behavior tracks right back into the school years and the early years. Fourthly, Habermas pointed out the difference between the system, the state and the market, and the life world, the free parts of our private lives by free association. Schools are part of the system, state schools, and they were started, Prussia had the first state schools. They were started to train up children to be in the army and in the factories. And they are to train up children to be submissive citizens and to watch unfair punishments, but not complain. And also nowadays in Britain, they're trained up to be cruel, to run cruel, harsh systems like the benefit system, the immigration system, the police. We have more private police, security officers than police. All of these careers demand that people treat each other people harshly and cruelly and unfairly and unquestioningly. And we need schools to train them up to do that. And finally, Jean Liedloff's lovely continuum concept of the babies. People remember the first 9 months of the babies always being held and close, but after that, the babies crawl off and start playing with knives, knowing to avoid fires, crawling near cliffs, but knowing not to fall off them. And parents really trusting these babies to have enormous sense of risk-taking, adventure, curiosity. So it's not just all sweetness, the continuum concept, it's adventure as well.
Itai, would you like to respond to Priscilla's
Wow.
comment?
I'll be happy to. First, thank you. But are you sure, Tanu? It will take me some time to answer. So maybe we'll take some more questions. Maybe there are questions to.
Okay, Carl, Victor, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask?
Yes. Thank you for these presentations. My question is also to Itai, and it follows a little bit on what Priscilla was talking about. I'm worried when thinking about the public school, even though I to some degree can follow Itai and also David. I'm really worried in the way that you speak about minorities in relation to public schools, because there's a risk here that we think of the public school as an abstract conception of a certain kind of schooling, and the reality and lived experience of minority children in schools of in public schools, I would say from my own personal experience working with minority children in many different schools, and particularly indigenous children, is that the colonial history of public school system as an actual main tool for colonization. I would say education has been one of the main tools. Taking children from their parents and in school system has been a way to disconnect these children's lived experience from the experience of the land where they live, which also makes the claims from the land less effective for these children, both juridically and in this sort of life narratives that they carry. And that is often thought about as a history, but I would say that even in democratic liberal welfare states, that is still the case. This is not an abstract problem. It's actually a lived problem right now, and it concerns language, it concerns connection to land and particular places, it concerns connection to cultures. And if you are in a culture where you have 3 speakers of your language in the whole school, it is not only a practical problem to work with this language, but it's quite a deep problem to have these languages continually to live on. And there, the public school system where the relation between majority and minority is at play, actually itself still contains this kind of problem. I'm not saying that there are not ways to get around that, but I have yet to see very good examples of that actually happening within a public school system where there are great differences between minorities and majorities. So I think it's more concerning and much more problematic than at least how I understood the explanation here. And I think it deserves delving deeper into it. So that was just my point, and critique of this idea of the public school that I need to be think I need to be pointed out to be able to continue to work with this idea and to be able to work with what is valuable with the idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I want to just read out Toby's comment in the chat. He says Ita is not talking about public school as they exist today, right? He's talking about what they could be. And just to reconcile, I think Carl, Victor, I know you're based in northern Norway, and especially Norway has a very strong public, schooling tradition, like even today. And I think some of the points and concerns that you're bringing up also, I think, come from the very concrete issues that we face with the Sami and indigenous, cultures and other minority cultures within Norway. But just to reconcile this, I think you're showing the hard problems we need to work through. But Zita, I saw you nodding to Toby's comment, saying it's about what this could be, and these are tricky and of course pressing concerns we need to navigate. Gustavo, you have your hand up. Would you like to comment?
Hello, are you listening me? Okay, I'll try to make some appointments also about the Itaia presentation. I have some doubts and issues that I would like to share. First of all, I think that this difference about school and family, this dichotomy of school and family, and that this translation of this difference in the terms of public and private provoked me to have some considerations. I don't really think that this dichotomy about public and private really fits when we say about school and family. Maybe in the neoliberal society, and when we are talking about a neoliberal society as a whole, where the families are seen like units, private units that have like their own values and their educations from this family are really private. But we are thinking in a decolonial way with indigenous people, family can mean so much other possibilities and configurations that not only private. We can speak about like extensive families that and their whole relations with other languages, other people, other cultures in the same family, because we don't have like this apart unit family from other community groups in some indigenous lands. So when we talk that in school, it's the only possibility that we in public can meet other values, and by this, it's the only possibility to have choices, to choose other values. I think we have like this specific family in mind, and we are not talking about these other possibilities of families that not are either public nor but are not also private. And I think it's relation with the question where children belong. I think it's a really hard question to answer. I don't think that children belongs to school or state, and I don't think that children belongs to parents as a property. And I think the property is an important concept here, because when I think Itai is saying about belonging, I think he's saying about a decision making and a capacity of the family to make decisions about these children like a property. And of course that way I think that children don't belong parents. But if we think that belonging as a much more possible concept, as feeling in a community, in a sense of belonging with a holistic scenario. I don't think that either the belonging of the parents it's the best way to think about the children concept, but maybe children can belong to the land, and the land not as the parents' land, or not that as a school, or not as the land that they born, but the land as a plastic world that they can engage with. And the land can have a school or not. But I think that when we think that the actual school that we live force the children to go like 5 days a week, sometimes this school can separate the children from the land. But sometimes, if the school is properly used, school can be part of the land also. But I think that the important should think that this plastic world, that the land where the children belongs, is the important one to think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. I mean, I also want to say there is a discussion in the chat if would like to read. Anita, I have to be a bit stringent with the time now. So if you want to briefly, please respond or yeah.
I do. I want. I mean, first, thank you for the interesting comments. A lot to think about. I cannot address everything, but Priscilla said that children, in a sense, do belong to the parent, of course. I'm obviously not against deep emotional relations between children and their families. In the paper, I mentioned the etymological origin of the word pupil, right? It means, in Latin, I think it means an orphan. A pupil is an orphan. They are temporarily deprived of the most caring and loving relations one they have with their parents. Now, this sounds awful. I'm fully aware of the fact. It sounds violent. It is, in a way, violent. It is violent. There is an inherent violence in schooling. But it is, or it can be thought of as liberating, in a sense. First, because it is temporary. Now, for a few hours, you are severe disconnected from your family, from your parents. And in a way, you are free to do something else. I hope this makes sense. I shouldn't have used the word violence without explaining it. In a way, there's a violent dimension in almost everything we do, maybe in everything we do. And there is violence in schooling, of course. But in a way, I think it is necessary, and the benefit from it that can be made from it is worth preserving. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to defend schools as they are. Obviously not. I'm not a sociologist, but I'm fully aware as a parent, as a former school teacher, and as a former pupil. I'm fully aware of many of the problems in contemporary schools. I'm not suggesting to preserve schools as they are. We have to rethink the idea of the public school. We have to reinvent the school. Now, the question is whether or not we insist on the public aspect of the school. And I think we must insist on this aspect. And I think it is also crucial. can be crucial also in terms of, from the child's perspective and from that of minority cultures. I'm not sure I can say much more. And I'm not sure there is a universal, say, formula that can work in Israel, Palestine, Canada, Latin America, and the UK in the exact same way. But I think we must insist on the public aspect of temporarily adding this dimension to the lives of children, telling them now, for limited time, you can choose. You can choose which or what tradition to engage with, and how. Now, families provide many beautiful things. Of course, what families are different, right? What is the famous quotation, right? All miserable families and all happy families are all different. And families are sometimes the most dangerous place. But we don't have to think about awful things that happen in families to understand that some liberation, at least temporary, from the family can be very important also when it comes to challenging adultcentrism or adultism. Now, of course, as Gustavo suggested, the family is not an isolated unit. But just as I think children should be offered the opportunity to take some distance from the family, and just the same way, I think they must be offered the opportunity to distance themselves from the community, from tradition, from the ethnic unit they may belong to or supposed to belong to. And well, and I think this is the challenge. Maybe this is, I try to be brief. This is the challenge, the real challenge we are facing as educators or as people thinking about education. How to reinvent school in a way that will allow all this to children. Because again, I think the only alternative in a way, every alternative to private schooling, at the bottom line, amounts to privatization, amounts to rich people sending the rich children to private expensive schooling, and all the others get the remains. I hope this is more or less clear. Sorry, I couldn't address all the comments.
Thank you, Itay. And I've also been thinking that perhaps, I mean, this is also a question of how to, reinvent what we understand as public here. When it's about, if from a childist perspective or, critical adult-centric perspective, defending a public school would need for us to re-examine what that public is also, and that might also, I think, address some of the concerns and also really hard problems that the respondents, and the audiences have shared. I would like to invite Joanna Haynes to share her impressions with us, followed by Toby Rollo now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. You just come out of sessions like this thinking there's so much more to read and so much more to think about. And I really appreciate the presentations today and the questions they've raised for me. Thank you, Yao, as well, for asking that question about what might we lose if we sort of give up this notion of childhood. And I think particularly looking from a different cultural perspective at these postmodernist ideas, there's great riches to explore there. So I appreciated your presentation. Thank you. And yes, I mean, I think the discussion also just shows the relevance of childism to just about every question there is. So yeah, what can I say in a few minutes at the end of this? I think I wanted where my attention was when I was reading the collection of papers, was in thinking about how to challenge my own adultism. And I appreciated your comments at the beginning, Tanu, about how the ways that we can learn from children's lives can point us towards the things, the attention that we need to pay to our own practices, including our academic practices, for example, including the practice here this afternoon, the ways that we think and talk and write and dialogue together. So my interest over the last 50 years really of working has been, I guess, focusing on intergenerational or between age relationships and responding to what is affecting rather than necessarily questions and ideas, but by what is moving and what is affecting. So in, for example, the papers, some of the papers in the special collection, I don't know about you, but I was very affected by the story of Peter crying in the classroom in Hedegaard's paper when the teacher kind of dismisses something that he said. I was very affected by those exploitative sexualized images of Black children in Stacey Patton's paper and the way that she linked those to the expression of white supremacism. I was affected by the many stories of environmental children activists in Castaneda's paper. So what happens when we start perhaps from those aspects of children's lives that are affecting? How might that reorientate our work as critics of adultism? Where else do we need to look? And I think this, again, for my own practice, my own thinking, is more of an orientation towards everyday life, towards those affecting flashpoints and the way that they can lead us maybe to minor gestures, to smaller actions, rather than a global analysis or a global policy, to minor kind of adjustments in how we are orientated to holding back, to listening, to attunement, to noticing what is usually hidden or invisible, particularly in our interactions with children. I think the work on the more than human is also an important place to look, because my feeling is that this orientation is also very sympathetic to children's ways of worlding and playing, the inclusion of the more than human, the inclusion of the material, the inclusion of animals, for example, in the natural world. I think finally, the point I want to make is to draw attention to who are we listening to and who are we citing in our scholarship. Are we listening to those who are the closest to children's lives, to their care, to their education? to their experiences. Who are the scholars that we are citing, and what difference might that make to the understandings that we reach? For example, I think many of the scholars working in post-developmentality are excluded or left out or omitted from some of the well, particularly from the conversations today. And they can link the critique of developmentality and the critique of coloniality and ways of understanding children's lives as, in terms of linear progression. So those are kind of rather scattered comments of trying to look perhaps in slightly different places and asking that question, what else? What might we have been missing? And what is it we ourselves need to try to change to challenge our own adultism? Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us and sharing your valuable comments, and also showing further pathways for us to pursue in this collective interest in critiquing adult-centric practices, including our own. Toby, I invite you to please share your views.
Okay, I'll try to be very quick here. So first of all, my apologies for arriving late. As fate would have it, I was roped into a discussion with elementary school administrators this morning about my little boy's experiences in school. We homeschooled both my son and my daughter for the first 10 years of their life, and we always told them that if they wanted to give public schooling a shot, they are free to do so. And if they didn't like it, they could come back home, whatever they wanted. And so right now they're giving it a shot at the public school system. And I'm seeing already the disjunctures between what schools, as they are capable of, and what my children's expectations for autonomy are. Okay, so I should have been presenting this sort of overview of the themes and of Ite and Yao's excellent papers at the beginning. It probably would have been much more suitable then, but you all very judiciously got on with it without me. So this will just be a summary, I guess, then of the papers and the themes of the dossier itself. So I'm really pleased that the dossier published in Childhood and Philosophy has served as a jumping off point for these really, really important discussions. So I'm very excited about that. So Dossier challenges entrenched adult-centric models by advancing 3 explicit themes that both the papers sort of touch on in different ways today: decentering adultism, reimagining schools as sites of genuine democratic participation, and engaging in a decolonial critique of traditional educational practices. You can see how the papers are already were really well suited and resonate with these themes. The contributors in general argued that the prevailing view of childhood as a mere stage before adulthood reinforces hierarchical power structures that marginalize children's diverse experiences and epistemic contributions. Yao's presentation is central to the theme of decentering adultism, drawing on postmodern theory. Yao challenges the conventional notion of a universal child by rejecting essentialist developmental models. I have a real strong affinity for these sorts of arguments. Instead of viewing childhood as a uniform progression toward predetermined adult state, the child becomes a fluid, socially constructed phenomenon. All of this, as John Wall pointed out, are fairly well-tread sort of paths in childhood studies, especially critical childhood studies. But Yao does an excellent job of showing that we need to move away from a one-size-fits-all model towards strategies that celebrate the multifaceted nature of children's lives. Complementing Yao's sort of theoretical critique, Ite's presentation addresses the practical implications of adultism at home and in the public school system. The discussion was actually quite enlightening. It allowed Ite to respond to what I think is probably going to be his readers' number one sort of worry is that certainly Ite can't be talking about public schools as they exist today. And I was happy to see that, of course, he's not talking about how they exist today, but as we saw through David Kennedy's contextualization of the sort of domain of this discussion, Ite is talking about schools as they could be. And I'm also very sympathetic to the idea that there should be spaces where children get to be themselves away from family, while recognizing that children are, of course, part of their families and a product of their culture and a product of those relationships. Ite's work does a great job, I think, of showing that children also need spaces that are not that. Just as adults need time away from their kids to recharge their batteries, children also need time away to recharge their batteries. I think one of the reasons my kids wanted to skip on homeschooling for a while and go to public school is so they could get away from boring dad and mom for a little bit. And unfortunately, the public schools as they are not the spaces they'd hoped they'd be. And I think that's what Ite is maybe getting at. And I think David's excellent sort of historical contextualization provides a good sort of background for that kind of discussion. So the reconceptualization challenges the idea that children are property of their parents. They don't belong to their parents in a proprietarian sense, but of course, as the commenters pointed out and Ite acknowledges, they belong to their parents and their communities in a relational sense, of course. Right, so Kennedy provided some excellent critical context. I loved listening to David's thoughts and reading his work. He touches on the indigenous education, how it historically embodied a kind of village model, a communal, interdependent, intergenerational approach, which supports Ite's motivations, I think, suggesting recovering this form of education, of course, in a different cultural context is very important. John Wall's caution when in discussions of postmodern approaches to childhood, I think we're really well situated in the discussion as well. I appreciate Wall's emphasis on the normative and how difference should not be collapsed into mere plurality, but we should understand difference in how it actually ends up being structured normatively, and that usually leads to some sorts of marginalization. And I think Yao's work here, using a postmodern lens of analysis, really allows us to get some traction on precisely those forms of marginalization. So by embracing the diversity of childhood and drawing on lessons from postmodernity, indigenous perspectives, I think the collection or the presentations today really sort of carve a different way of thinking, and I've really enjoyed the discussion. I wish we had more time for discussion, and I'm speaking rapidly because I want to not take up too much time in case there is more time for discussion, but very much appreciate everything. And I'm very happy that the dossier is actually going to be leading to further colloquia, and of course the child studies at Rutgers there is going to be having further colloquia on these sorts of issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby, and I also thank everyone for being patient and also staying longer. We've gone over time, but this has been really an excellent discussion. I also am very pleased with the special issue and that this is leading to further conversations, and thank both the Childism Institute, the Childhood and Philosophy, and all the authors and commentators for and the audience who has come today as well for being part of this. And as we said, we're also happy and that these conversations, and we want to be very sure that these conversations are not only happening in English, but we also make space for different languages as much as possible. We have not yet found a good way to mediate the translation, live translation requirements, which would have been ideal. but we'll get there someday. But for now, we will stick with conversations in various languages. The next one is on 27th of March. It will be in French and has Elsa Roland and Serena Iacobino, authors presenting their works with comments from Yves Bonardel, Gabrielle Allegre, Claire Gressle-Favier, who I saw was in the room today, and Cecile Kovakashi. And if we are lucky, because to challenge our own practice, if we're lucky, we might have with us Cesar, who is a 12-year-old rapper from France, and Cesar raps about climate justice. We have sent, you might check out his video on YouTube here, and if Cesar and his dad accept our invitation, Cesar will open the conversation in French. So we have the space also with the voice of and a critique of adultcentrism from someone who connects to it from positions we try to understand in our work. And the other events will also, they're all advertised on the Childism Institute page, and we will also be circulating invitations as we get closer to the dates. Thank you again, everyone, for coming today and being part of these conversations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you.